So, Marc, you have spent much of your career in developing innovative approaches to real-world evidence and data analytics. Could you explain to us what you think the major issues are that our industry is grappling with today that will change how we both conduct research and utilize real-world evidence?
Sure. Well, first and foremost, the regulators are evolving in how they're using real-world evidence, and their stance about how it can inform labeling is changing. Surely we've been using real-world evidence forever for safety in updating the safety part of the label, but we're now seeing it updating the effectiveness part of the label. And although for years FDA has been accepting external control arms from real-world data as part of it, as part of substantial evidence, they now have an example where they have used just real-world evidence as substantial evidence. So recently, the FDA has approved tacrolimus, a Prograf for lung transplant, solely on the basis of real-world evidence. So previously, it had been used in kidney and heart transplant, but it did not have an indication for lung transplantation. So the company submitted data based upon the US Transplant Registry, which concluded all the patients in the US who've had a transplant. And it's a database that the FDA has had experience with and known and knew it to be accurate and complete. And it showed that it was effective for lung transplant. And that data was then used to provide a new indication. So that's an evidence that they will do this and just use real-world evidence. The question is, what are the lessons learned there? Another example just came recently in China, where Prolia was approved for treatment of osteoporosis. And this was based upon leveraging the randomized controlled trials that had been done around the world, but not in China, and adding real-world evidence from Taiwan and Hong Kong, which showed that they got similar benefits with the same relative risks as you'd expect. And so it was approved for use in China. So both of these examples raise questions about, okay, so is real-world evidence coming of age? Can we use it to support new label indications for treatments? And the answer is yes, with a lot of caveats. We don't have clarity as yet about what data is, when is data good enough to support regulatory decision-making, and when is data fit for purpose for a particular question that is being faced by a regulatory agency. And these will need to be clarified over time. There are some outlines of this that are coming out of draft guidances coming out of the FDA and work products coming out of the EMA as they're putting together their own real-world guidance and how to assess the quality of data. Mm-hmm. Now, second after this is that there is a cultural change going on. And we also know that culture is harder to change than anything else. There's an old expression that culture eats strategy for lunch every day. And there is no doubt that the single most important advance in clinical research in the 20th century was the development of the randomized controlled clinical trial. That allow us to impute causation and see if a drug really works. And that's been terrific. Well, everybody who's grown up with that rightly sees that as the gold standard, but they have resisted seeing that there are other ways that you can get good evidence to support effectiveness. And this has to do with a whole new generation of data analysts who have grown up, who are not the old statisticians, and the hope that one day that we'll move from our current system that you only can gain new scientific evidence by doing one-off experiments to a culture where we learn by doing, in which case we would then have a learning healthcare system where we're constantly learning about what works and for whom as care is delivered.
Marc, I
In the
want to jump in
meantime,
there about the learning healthcare system. That's been an area of interest for you for so many years. Why is that not a more accepted way of implementing and delivering healthcare? What is the holdup with that? It's so obvious.
well, it's the amount of regret you're going to have for making a mistake. So when you are making a decision at a patient's bedside for a particular patient, then evidence-based medicine says you use the best available evidence. It doesn't say you use only the best quality evidence. It says you use the best available evidence. And in that case, there have been instances where clinicians and institutions have queried their own databases and gotten information because there was no good published study that told them what to do in a particular case. And in one case like that, they did that and the patient had a good outcome, but the institution warned them not to do that again because if they got a bad outcome, the institution would be held liable. Mm-hmm. So that issue of liability is one which cautions people. The second thing is that if you learn something in real world evidence, it might be true in the population you studied it in. How do you know that it's going to be accurate for other populations? And that gets to the idea that we shouldn't trust any one real world data study or any one real world evidence study. We'd like to see it replicated in different populations by different researchers using
and
different.
That's true for RCTs, right?
That's true for RCTs. So with those caveats, then the idea that we can start trusting real world evidence as we do it really requires a large shift in what we think is good enough evidence. Now, right now we want to have it proven so that when we do it, we feel bulletproof about our recommendations. The other way of thinking about that is with industrial management, and think about continuous quality improvement, that you do something, and if it gets you the answer you want, you're heading in the right direction. If you're not getting the answer that would be helpful, then you have to adjust what you're doing. So that's the way you, over time, make sure that your outputs are increasingly tightly clustered and accurate and what you want. And that idea of an industrial management approach to medicine is not widely acceptable. It's culturally different. In the meantime, I would say what people are starting to default to is they are looking at the development of large, trusted, real-world data sets that have been curated and are administered by governments. So we have Sentinel in the US, and we have Darwin being created in the EU. And because they are being done in a transparent manner, and all the data curation is done in a transparent manner, and you know the source of the data, then there'll be greater trust in the results that come out of these things. However, it really depends on their being fully transparent about what they've done, where the data came from, how they transformed it, how they analyzed it, and have they put it into a causal framework. So the message or the badge that says this is a government sponsored data set is not good enough. They're going to have to lead the way with transparency.
So in order to demonstrate trust, you say that one needs to be fully transparent, and you alliterated a few examples of what transparency might mean, the data source, how it's transformed, etc. Where might that information be held, and who would manage that information? Should it be in a publicly available space, do you think?
Well, some of it needs to be in a publicly available space. So when I advise people about what they should be thinking about if they're going to submit real world evidence to a regulator, I tell them there are three elements they have to pay really close attention to. One is good study hygiene. The second is rigorous study design. And the third is a rigorous analytics plan. And under good study hygiene means that they have to post and pre-specify what their protocol and analysis plan is in advance before they do any of the analytics. So whether they put it on clinicaltrials.gov or the EU PASS registry or the new registry that's on Open Science Foundation, you have to convince people that you are not data dredging looking for a good answer, that indeed you had a question, it was a hypothesis testing question, and that you specified it, and that you had told people how you intended to investigate it. Mm-hmm. And that needs to be on a publicly available website. Now, other things also need to be on a publicly available website, like when you report out the results of your study, you have to be completely transparent in your execution. So we know that when we do many of these studies, we do a feasibility analysis to see if there's enough patients in a data set to do a question. But then we get in and do we find all the covariates we need or whatever, and you have to modify your analysis plan. Well, if you do that, you have to document that you modified your analysis plan and say why. And that needs to be, again, publicly available, whether in a report, in a peer-reviewed paper, or on a registry. And finally, there has to be a way to track what is done back to the original data source. So just like the FDA and other regulators require traceability to original data sources, they're going to require traceability to data sets. Mm-hmm. So we know that there was an example a couple of years ago during the COVID pandemic where there was a data source that led to publications in both NEJM and Lancet, and that they had to be withdrawn because it wasn't a real data set. So you need to be able to somehow, and the question is, what does that look like? What does that traceability look like? Do you have to get your hands on the analytic data set, or do you actually have to get to the original data source and be able to query it to convince yourself of the adequacy of that data source? So good study hygiene is the first part. And then there's rigorous study design. The entire question is, can you draw causal inferences if you want to make a claim about effectiveness or efficacy? And we haven't done as much as we need to be doing routinely to do that. So one way to do that is to take the target trial approach that Miguel Hernan has proposed, in which when you design your real-world evidence study, you first design it as you would as if you were doing a clinical trial. And then you try and come as close as you can to emulating that clinical trial as you possibly can do. And if you do that, you're more likely to be able to have a study that will be able to do causal inference. Another thing we often don't do is that we don't put our studies into a causal analysis framework. And there are several frameworks that have been put forth about causal analyses. And there's some recent work people are doing in which you can look at observational or real-world evidence studies to see if they fit into a causal analysis framework. But I think they should explicitly, sponsors and researchers should explicitly put their studies into a causal analysis framework. And finally, there are tools that are being put forth that can help researchers not make silly mistakes. So the Harper framework was recently proposed by a joint task force of ISPOR and ISPI, and I was privileged to be part of that, in which it goes through and makes you, or you ask all the questions as you design and begin to think about doing your research so that you don't make silly mistakes. One of the things that has come to the fore recently is that, yes, we need to be worried about confounding and bias, but some of the biggest mistakes have been due to flaws in study design, in not identifying time zero. And that was the case. That was the case with hormone replacement therapy, getting different results between RCTs and observational studies in terms of their cardiac benefit to postmenopausal women.
Mm-hmm.
Finally, the third piece is rigorous analytic plans, and they have to, as much as they can, account for bias and confounding, and not only the stuff that is measured, but really you should say, here are other things that we think could be confounding, but we haven't measured them. So how you do a residual analysis to see how much of confounding is left is important, and how you do sensitivity analyses to see how much the confounding may have changed things are really important. And again, here, some of the ISPOR, ISPI Good Task Force reports are very useful.
So to summarize then, the must-haves and must-dos for real-world evidence, you would say, are good study hygiene, rigorous study design, and rigorous analytic plan.
Exactly.
I'd like to follow up on something you said about the methods, and you suggested that there is a recommendation to look at your real-world evidence methodology and try to make it as close to an RCT as possible. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Yes. So what's the downside of that? Does that really almost let the design define the objective rather than the objective define the design?
No, actually not. So we would all agree, if there was no cost and no obstacles to doing randomized controlled clinical trials, that would be the best way to answer any question. Now, there have been studies published to show that perhaps only 15% of clinical trials can be emulated well by real-world evidence studies. And recently, some major work coming out of Harvard has shown that, and this is called the Duplicate RCT project, which was sponsored by the FDA, that in fact, when you can emulate closely an RCT, that is, you can make your variables, both your covariates and your outcomes and your exposures, look like they really match to what would be in an RCT. In the vast majority of cases, you get the same result as you would with an RCT. In cases where you cannot directly emulate exactly what the outcome measure is, and you have to use some proxy, or you can't really measure a covariate the way you'd want to, and so using something a little bit distant from that covariate, then the results become less likely to accurately reflect what you got in the RCT. So it's not that you can't do that, it's that you have to completely and transparently describe how far away from the RCT are you when you're doing your observational trial or your real-world evidence trial. And that information then can be taken into account by the regulator and saying, how credible is this information? Does this meet the standard for adequate and comprehensive data or not? And that will also be context dependent. It will depend on the question at hand, so that if you're developing a new if you're trying to find evidence for a therapy where there are few therapeutic alternatives and there is a huge unmet medical need, what is considered to be substantial evidence is different than when you're giving people a prophylactic that you're going to give to millions of people, and you won't know whether it works for years and years to come. So we don't always need a randomized controlled clinical trial. And this was the subject of a humorous article a few years ago. I think it was in Lancet, which said, are we going to do an RCT to show that wearing a parachute when you jump out of a plane prevents you from dying? And the answer is no, we're not. We think that that's good enough to my experience.
Mm-hmm.
And the bar is much higher for proving causal inference for new therapeutics, but the same thing applies. I don't think we need randomized control evidence in every case to convince ourselves the new therapeutic works. Certainly, that has been the case historically.
So let's go back to that tacrolimus Prograf case that where the FDA approved the new indication for lung cancer for the compound. What motivated FDA to agree that the real-world evidence was sufficient and that an RCT was not required in that particular situation?
Well, it checked all of the boxes. We haven't talked about what are the criteria for good quality research, but it even though they haven't spelled them out particularly well, this one did check it. First of all, it was a known data source. It was a data source that we know it exists. We know its quality. There's little missing data in the transplant registry. They had experience in using it before, so they had some sense of experience and track record of using it. It was relevant because it included all of the patients. It wasn't a sample of patients in the US. It was all of the patients in the US. So there's no question about, was it representative of the population that it was deemed necessary to treat. Plus, they had ample RCT evidence in other indications, which might lead you to believe that it should be efficacious in other situations where they have similar biomarkers. And so there was every reason to believe it. Then it was unethical to do an RCT. We've been using tacrolimus for years in lung transplant, so no one was ever going to do an RCT. Everything lined up there so that the FDA could say, yes, we believe that there is substantial evidence that tacrolimus works in lung cancer. And by the way, this gives us a bar that you can look at that may not have to be crossed by everyone who wants to get an indication based upon real world evidence, but this kind of tells you what an ideal would look like.
Mm-hmm. So just a minor side note, I started my career as a product manager for Sandimmune cyclosporin in organ transplant. And we did at that time what I believe was one of the very early real world evidence studies where the research question was, does a particular dosage of Sandimmune prevent organ rejection? We were seeing that in the real world that physicians were decreasing the dose over time from a cost standpoint. It was at the time the most expensive drug in the world for $8,000 a year. And while Medicare picked up a good portion of the cost, it didn't pick up all of them. And so patients were pushing back on their doctors, skipping doses. And so the doctors began to try to diminish the dose. And then we began seeing, because we had very good data about the duration of organ survival, that their rejection was occurring sooner. So we put together about 100 different transplant physicians around the United States and paid organ transplant coordinators to pull the data on the dosage and the likelihood of organ transplant, and published this article. And in a New England Journal. And it was a really amazing example as we began pushing that data out to the doctors of how they began accepting that information far more than they would with an RCT, because this was data from their peers and they had the knowledge that that it was providing insight beyond what they were getting in published clinical trials. So that was back in 1986. And that experience, this is completely aside, but that experience then caused me, because I was very interested in how we designated the value of life, because they were pushing back so much on the cost, $8,000 to save a life. We had no terminology in the United States at the time for that. So then I went back to school and to Wharton and to Penn to study under McGann to cobble together a PhD in health economics, which did not exist at the time. So it's really fascinating to me how the arena of transplant, both from the government choosing to pay because it was societally good and better than dialysis, they chose to reimburse it and pay for it, and how it also informed probably some of our early thinking on real world evidence.
Very interesting.
Marc, one of the issues that you have noted is the need for regulatory authorities, including the FDA, to provide further clarifications on the use of real-world evidence as they make judgments on approving new indications or a new drug. What specific clarifications would be helpful from the US FDA that manufacturers and researchers can use that will help them understand the guidepost?
So the FDA has put out very general statements about the reliability and accuracy of data as measures of data quality. But they haven't really gone down into the weeds to tell you what does that exactly mean. So we have had many articles published and groups brought together to talk about what data quality is. And there are many logic checks that people use in order to look at the degree of missingness, the degree of longitudinality. Are there gaps in the data over time that you should know about? Are there numbers that are out of range and therefore need to be corrected? What do you do with missing data? Do you censor data, or do you use multiple imputation to put and replace the missing data? There were many checks like this. The FDA hasn't weighed in on what kind of quality checks you need to do to establish what is the overall level of quality of the data set. Mm-hmm. They also have said that they want to be able to have verify the data. And they haven't been clear about what that means. This gets back to what I talked about traceability. In RCTs, you can get back to the original case report form. Does the FDA need to get back to the original electronic health record? Or does it have to be able to get back to the original data source to see how it was put together and understand how it was curated? That remains to be clarified. And then the definition about what fit for purpose needs more discussion. We know that fit for purpose is to a certain extent bespoke. It depends on the question that you're asking. If you're doing a descriptive study of treatment patterns or natural history, you probably don't need the AAA plus quality data that you need if you want to show that you can draw a causal inference and that drug X causes some outcome Y. Mm-hmm. And so if fit for purpose is bespoke, what are the criteria that makes it requires it to be much more rigorous, or will accept less rigorous conditions. And some of that has to do with, as we talked about, context. What are the treatment alternatives? How serious is the condition, the unmet medical need, et cetera. And then what about the use of RWE when it's an adjunct to RCTs, and when can it be used in the absence of RCTs? So right now we're mostly talking about the use of RWE as an adjunct to RCTs. You have some RCTs that got the product on the market to start, and then you add the RWE to increase our insight, much like you did with the example you talked about in the 1980s. But there will be cases in the future where we might find drugs that were already approved for one purpose may have a totally different purpose that is discovered by real-world evidence. Do we need to go back and do an RCT? That remains to be seen. And what's complicating this even further has been the increasing use of the accelerated approval process by the FDA. And the FDA more recently with some of the Alzheimer's drugs are mandating that they need to have follow-up RCTs. There's some evidence, weak evidence, that these drugs improve some of the biomarkers for Alzheimer's. There's also some evidence that they cause some side effects, and the magnitude of that side effect problem is also unclear. But they've been approved because of this large unmet medical need. Now, these RCTs can take 7 to 9 years to complete. In the meantime, we can spend billions of dollars depending on how many people get these drugs and because of the need. What about mandating registries, saying that if you're going to launch a product, everyone who gets that product has to be enrolled in a registry? Or we say this is a disease that needs to be more thoroughly followed, and so we're going to enroll everybody with a particular disease in a registry. Or if that is too hard to implement, will we start mandating the collection of real-world data from all of these patients and collecting that centrally so we can begin to analyzing that? These are questions that need to be thought out. You want to get, I applaud the FDA because they want to inspire and promote innovation, particularly for diseases that are terrible and don't have good treatments. On the other hand, we also want to be mindful about how we do that and make sure we're getting the information as rapidly as possible to assure us that the benefit risk profiles of these drugs are what we think they are.
So do you think that it is an appropriate thing for the FDA to have an internal dialogue or a dialogue with their stakeholders about the cost effectiveness of an RCT versus a real world evidence study?
I don't know if that's, I think it's always good for the FDA and the sponsors and also the data holders to have a good conversation. That needs to happen anyway, as we talk about modus of operandi, about how real world data will be made available to the FDA so that they can have that traceability, and also so that the FDA can get a sense of the quality of different data sources. Whether or not that group will make a decision about whether you need to do an RCT or not, that's a matter for public discourse. And it's a little bit in the eye of the beholder. And you may get experts who say, absolutely, before I do this, I want to have an RCT. Or others might say, I think we have enough, and I think we can get the supplementary evidence through real world evidence. But I don't know that there is a simple, easy answer for this. and I don't have a formula to provide anybody with. And I don't think I don't think that I think that that needs to be done as a transparent discussion, so that everyone can see why decisions have been made.
So you've just listed out several issues that you seek clarification from the FDA on. I'm going to summarize those. Data quality and how much verification is required, whether it's fit for purpose and how that's defined, whether it can be used as an adjunct to RCTs, and also how it would be used in accelerated approval. Those are four major guideposts, if you will, for RWE usage by a regulatory authority. However, each one of those is their own large conundrum. If you were to advise the FDA, what would be one or two things that you would say, I think you can plant a flag in the sand on this issue now?
So the FDA is not going to plant a flag. Let's be clear. The FDA is a cautious agency, and appropriately so, and they want to get more use cases and see what works and what doesn't work for them to move in a direction of having clear standards. But I think that they could be much clearer on the elements that they are considering or the things that they are requiring. So to me, I put them into the following categories. Authenticity. You want to know the data really exists, and you have to have enough assurance that the data that you collected was real data that was collected. And that means there has to be some way to audit back to the original data. And how deep that audit goes, I don't know. But there needs to be some sort of traceability, much like there is in RCTs. Mm-hmm. Then the second thing is transparency. Everything done needs to be transparent. So how the data was, who originally acquired the data? What was it acquired for? How was it put into a data ocean or a data lake or a database, whatever you want to call it? Did they use a common data model? Did they transform the data? What logic text did they look for completeness and accuracy and other things? All of that, and they should be reporting out what are some basic statistics that they found on the overall data set. It may not be the data you need to know for the particular question at hand, but you'd like to know it as a background level of quality for that data set. Then,
what statistics would they be looking at there?
Excuse me?
What statistics are you talking about there?
Statistics such as completeness and the number of out of range data points would be two.
Okay.
Then you want to know about the relevance, and relevance means multiple things. It first means, do you have the population that you're intending to treat in your data set? I mean, some data sets are really good for oncology, like Flatiron, but it's not a data set I would go to study diabetes. They didn't collect diabetes patients. So do you have the patients of interest? Are they representative of the total population you're interested in? And do you have adequate numbers and longitudinal follow-up to ask the question that you want to ask? So that whole idea of relevance could be made more explicit. Mm-hmm. And then accuracy. I don't know what we don't know what good enough accuracy means right now. Mm-hmm. But how are they going to define good enough accuracy? So I'm not sure I know the answer to that, but more thought has to be gotten into how they're going to say, how much uncertainty is around the estimates that you're getting of treatment effectiveness for them to feel confident that this is a reproducible finding.
Mhm.
And then lastly, I think they should be asking for a track record. I think anybody who submits real world evidence from a real world data source should send in all the published data that has been using that real world data source, where they try to draw a causal inference.
Mhm.
And all the times when they tried to cause a causal inference, did it work or did it fail? Both published and unpublished studies. The full use experience of that data source should be made available. And in order to give some context about the reliability
Mhm.
of that as a data source.
Artificial intelligence like ChatGPT and other approaches, can that be used to deduce whether or not a data source is real or potentially fraudulent?
I don't know the answer to that question. I have been known as a bit of a machine learning AI skeptic, and
Mhm.
I think some of the things coming out of ChatGPT are truly astounding. But they're doing different things than we're doing than you'd be asking it to do to analyze a data source. So um, backing up for a second, when we've been using AI or ML to do prediction, particularly in the medical sphere, it has not outperformed a standard statistical analysis. Um, and you ask, why is that? Well, that's because largely the data sets that we're using are not really big data sets. Big data sets don't have 10 features, 20 features, 50 features. They have 1,000 features, 10,000 features. That's when the real power of AI can come in. So when you have a relatively small number of features, our standard statistics work pretty well. Now, where AI has been very successful and has outperformed other things has been in image recognition, because you're just dealing with pixels, and it's a limited number of ways that variables we can look at, and it's been very successful in saying this is a cat, or whatnot. And now you can make it do with large language things. All right, write me a sonnet about such and such, and it can imitate that. It's okay. And it's not found as much success as we would have hoped were, but seen it's a lot of application has been in omic analysis, in transcriptomics, genomics, metabolomics, et cetera, and melding that with clinical information to make better predictions about who is at greater risk for progression of disease.
Mhm.
And that's because, to some extent, we still have to use shortcuts. So when you do these analyses, and if you're going to look for every possible correlation between everything that's there, if you run all of those correlations, it can take weeks or months to have a runtime. So what they currently do is they take shortcuts. They say, well, we know this part of the genome is part we should be paying attention to, so we'll pay attention to this part of the genome, and we'll ignore the rest. But we know that the stuff between the genes is very important from a regulatory standpoint. And we also know that with the binding of materials to the DNA, epigenomics, that it changes the impact of what the DNA is telling the cells to do. We haven't even scratched that surface. So the amount of complexity is much, much greater than we're actually scratching the surface of. And we're just not there yet. And so that part of the limitation is runtime, or you could say part of the limitation is hardware. Graphical processing units were much better than CPUs, but they're not where we need to be, even if you array them in multiple nodes.
Mhm.
We're going to need some breakthroughs in technology, and whether that turns out to be quantum computing or something else, I don't know. But we're going to have to upgrade our hardware in order to be able to actually explore the true power of machine learning and artificial intelligence. And that may happen in the near future. I don't know, but I'm not expecting it.
We do a lot of research and exploration in the background, and then have to translate that for the prescribers and the patients in our true healthcare system. How would you state that our medical community, how receptive is our medical community to information that is derived from artificial intelligence or machine learning? What hurdles are there, and what do we need to do to help facilitate that appreciation and skepticism?
Well, the skepticism is perfectly natural and appropriate, because what comes out of AI and machine learning right now is a black box. We know what the predictions are, but we don't know why. And physicians, and for that matter, policymakers, they want to know the why. So there's a big controversy in AI ML about making machine learning more explicable and more transparent. And that may be hard to do. But I expect there to be approaches in which we start using an array of different AI ML approaches and seeing if the different approaches all come towards the same result, which might give greater confidence that this is a real result. I also think that they might be asking for, okay, you gave me this result, let's do this with standard statistics, and at least show me directionally I'm getting the same result. I may not get the same confidence intervals, but show me that we're going in the same direction. I want to know that the things that are most important load the way they do, the way I understand them. And then there is the overall issue of skepticism on the part of physicians. Physicians don't really like to think probabilistically, and almost everything that comes out is probabilistic. So there's going to need to be different training of physicians in order to make them more comfortable with probabilistic thinking. And probably this is all about a generational change. Anybody who came out of medical school in the 70s probably is not as open to new ways of thinking as they might be as if you're coming out of medical school now in the 2020s. And so as the older generation leaves the field, you're going to find not only doctors, but people who are staffing regulatory agencies or HTA agencies. They're going to be more willing to accept this kind of information. And as data continues to improve, which it is, and as analytic approaches continue to improve, which they are, I think we'll see greater and greater use of this over time.
So one of the things that always troubles me, and I think that's the right word, is as a peer reviewer, how is it ever going to be possible to be provided when a manuscript is submitted to a journal? How is a peer reviewer going to be able to access all of the information they need to have in order to deduce whether or not the data source is appropriate, quality, fit for purpose, whether the statistics or the AI and analytic approaches are appropriate? It just strikes me that we, in an area of journal publishing, that there's fewer and fewer words and pages that are allowed for individuals who publish, but there's more and more need for greater information. How are we going to resolve that conflict?
Well, there are two problems here. There's one of space, which you're talking about, which I think is a false issue. More and more journals are publishing online appendices to their
Mhm.
articles. And they certainly could have appendices sent in on their submissions. And theoretically, they could send in the data set if they wanted to, de-identified, to let a reviewer look at the data set. The real problem is expertise. So peer review is better than not having peer review, and it has over time done an overall good job. But we also know that a lot of people are doing peer reviews outside their expertise, or
Mhm.
don't have the full time to dedicate to doing a good review. And the kind of review that you would have to do to really be thoroughly convinced that this was the right data set, it's a quality data set, it's fit for purpose, the analytics were done right, and the amount of transparency that would have to come, documentation that would have to come with that, would be enormous and is not compatible with our current peer review process.
Mhm.
So I don't know the answer to that, but part of that might come down the line with the pre-certification of particular databases.
Mhm.
I don't know how we would do that, but we already today act that way. We believe the Medicare data set is an accurate data set.
Mhm.
We believe that the MedStat market scan data set is a good data set.
Mhm.
We believe that the Clinformatics data set from United is a good data set. Now, that's because people have a lot of experience using these.
Mhm.
And there's the data set from England that people use all the time. These data sets would need to be re-looked at from time to time to make sure that they still have the quality that we think they have. But you could imagine a set of experts looking at it and then publishing the data quality metrics on the general data set to let you believe that this is a good data set. And if a
Mhm.
new data set comes along, we'd like to see a whole lot more published about it before we start using that data set to make regulatory decisions.
Should we
Um,
have a dataset.org
I,
site, much like we have clinicaltrials.org?
I again, this is beyond my pay grade. I would just say that we're going to have to find a way to make it manageable, that every time you review a study, you don't have to go back to completely to square one to ask the question whether, is this a legitimate data set? Has it been curated in an appropriate way? What are the quality metrics that let me know in general how much missingness or how much out of range data there was, and how much continuity of the data there is? We're going to have to find a way to shortcut that, and that solution will have to come out of discussions in the public sphere.
You do a lot of consulting, and if you were to give advice to a biopharma manufacturer on how to organize or set up their operational centers to maximize real-world evidence availability, application, and impact, what advice would you give to them?
Well, advice I have already given, but has not been widely taken up, I would say.
Here's your chance to say it all again, Marc.
Is that they first have to stop thinking about them as pharmaceutical manufacturers. They are not in the business of developing new drugs. They are in the business of knowledge management and knowledge dissemination. And only when they start to think about that, and that goes back all the way to the basic science, all the way through everything that's happening in the real world, are they going to realize that their biggest investment is going to have to be in information and data, and
Mm,
people who can help them analyze and interpret information and data. And when they do that, then they'll start realizing that that is critical to their long-term success, and they'll make the kind of investments in people, infrastructure, and data sources that they should be making. Right now, it's still viewed as the cost center. They're doing some of it. Some companies have made a big bet, like Roche did when it bought Flatiron. But most of the companies would say they overpaid for Flatiron, and remains to be seen that they're going to get their return on investment for that amount of money, because the C-suite always is asking for a return on investment. So you're telling me I have to spend X million dollars on data sets, and I have to hire X hundred number of data analysts, and that's going to give me a payback now? The answer is it'll give them a payback over the long term. It may not give them a payback over the next 18 months to 2 years.
So are you suggesting that there be less expenditure in research and development and more expenditure in knowledge management and analysis of data?
I don't think it's less than, I think that's all part of R&D. So I think it's expanding the R&D investment. The question is, then you're going to have to make choices. Am I going to expand the overall R&D budget and take away from marketing and administration and sales? Or am I going to take some of it out of other parts of the R&D budget? Those are really, really hard questions. I'm not sure that, even though I spent 25 plus years in the industry, that I know what the right answer is in order to maximize the long-term profitability of a company. I do know that the companies that are going to put more investment into knowledge management are going to be the ones who are going to be more likely still be around in 15 years. And the ones who don't are likely going to be forgotten in history.
So Marc, you recently returned from ISPOR North America in Boston for their 2023 annual meeting. What were some of the key takeaways from that meeting?
Oh, I guess the first key takeaway is that everybody's gaga about AI and ML. And I think that just like everyone else in the world, there's a lot of people being overtaken by the hype of AI and ML. I mean, it is the shiny new object, and people are amazed at some of the things it can do. And the FDA is taking a very rational approach to this. The FDA just issued a discussion paper on the use of AI and ML in drug development, and I recommend it to you highly. It's a very well thought out piece. They also have a discussion paper they released on the use of AI and ML in drug manufacturing, where I think it's going to have more impact sooner. So AI and ML are here to stay. The question is, how do we use it intelligently and not get ahead of our skis? And that was the biggest worry I came out with after ISPOR. The other thing I think is that we're at a inflection point for real world data and real world evidence. I think that it's no longer a question of if we're going to be using real world data and real world evidence to inform a range of regulatory decisions, HTA decisions, payer decisions, and provider decisions. It's a question of when and how. And 10 years from now, if I'm lucky to still be here and still going to ISPORs, I expect the conversation to be markedly different.
If we have this conversation in 5 years, and I hope we're both around to have it, what do you think that we will be discussing as the major issues in value evidence and access for the pharmaceutical industry?
That's a whole nother topic. So, how we define value has undergone a lot of evolution over the last 60 years. but that is tied with how we finance medical research and how we finance healthcare delivery.
Mm-hmm.
And the anchor for that, you mentioned transplantation for kidneys, but the anchor for that goes back to dialysis in the 1960s when it first came to be. And I remember watching a documentary in Seattle where they opened one of the first dialysis centers, and they had a expert panel, including not experts, but also people from the community, trying to decide who was going to get dialysis, who would live and who would die.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, life and death, it's not, you can't put a number on that in some respects, when especially if it's you or a loved one.
Mm-hmm.
Cost effectiveness came into the conversation in the late 70s, early 80s, and it certainly is a very important approach to try and think about how you make allocation choices of resources. But we know that cost effectiveness is not the only thing that is considered when we make resource allocation choices. So that's why NICE has backed away from pure cost effectiveness and now uses different adjustments for oncology and rapidly fatal diseases, because we feel that there is a ethical reason to be more considerate of those.
Mm-hmm.
And we also know, and whenever I quote this, people laugh at me. If you go back to Kenneth Arrow, who got a Nobel Prize for decision-making in pluralistic societies, that you cannot maximize everybody's benefit and meet everybody's preference. It's impossible.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean you can't get close. And by getting close, then the way to do that is through a deliberative process where all stakeholders are involved and everybody feels like they got a fair hearing and they got a fair shake. So when you make a decision, losers feel like they're doing okay. I mean, one of the assumptions of cost-effectiveness analysis is Pareto optima, in which the winners can compensate the losers. Well, you can't compensate the losers when you're making decisions about access to healthcare.
Mm-hmm.
And then more recently, we now see that some of the newer therapies that are coming out, some of the newer therapies which are very, very expensive, and some of the gene therapies which are ultra virally expensive, like $3 million,
Mm-hmm.
those expenses cannot be reconciled with our current scheme for financing healthcare. So whether you think it's financing of innovation or you think it's how we're going to pay for treatment, this does not work out with our current schema. And I don't care whether it's the single payer system in Europe or it's the non-system of multiple payers in the US. Our system was not set up for this. It worked well when drugs represented a very small proportion of our healthcare spend. It doesn't work well when it's now going to become a significant and growing portion of our healthcare spend. Mm-hmm. So that means that the framework for value that we've had in place, and largely informed by cost effectiveness, is going to have to be modified. Mm-hmm. Either we're going to have to modify the threshold and start saying that, cost effectiveness has this threshold. They've already recommended that we move the threshold from $50,000 per quality adjusted life year to $100,000 to $150,000 quality adjusted life year. But even then, when you do that, if we gave every person in the country who were clearly indicated to get a treatment, and we were only giving it to the right patient at the right time and in the right manner at the right dose, we would bankrupt our healthcare system. We would bankrupt our economy. We can't afford to provide all of that at these cost effectiveness thresholds. So what do we do with that? I don't have the answer to that, but I do know that disruption is coming. And disruption is coming now with the Inflation Reduction Act.
Mhm.
And so the nose of the camel is under the tent. If the government can start negotiating prices in the US, which is the cash cow for industry worldwide, it's where the industry makes most of the money,
Mhm.
what's going to happen? And they're going to be relying more and more on real world data and real world evidence to show you have the value. And measuring that value is going to be problematic when the cost of treatment becomes exorbitantly expensive. And so, what's going to happen? Well, one thing that people fear is that the industry is going to invest less in new drug development. And they're going to focus their drug development on those areas which are not covered by the Inflation Reduction Act,
Mhm.
or in areas where they know that the value can be most readily demonstrated, and shy away from the others where there is less opportunity to demonstrate value.
Mhm.
Or they could end up shrinking. They could say a vertically integrated pharmaceutical company doesn't make sense anymore. We'll let startups take all the risk with the drug discovery, and then we'll just license them when they're in phase 2A or somewhere thereabouts, and we'll bring the ones that are most likely to have value and be successful and get regulatory approval. We'll take those to market. That could be another way things go. Um, I am not Nostradamus, but I do know that the current marketing model, the prevalent marketing model that is the engine for the economic model of pharmaceutical companies, which is to come out with blockbuster drugs and charge as much as you can for them to fund every other drug that doesn't make it to the market, I'm not sure that that is going to be sustainable.
Mhm. Marc, is there anything else that you would like to touch on?
No, we've had a nice conversation. Thank you very much.
I've enjoyed it so much.